Welcome to Poets Theater. I'm really happy and honored to have Sebastian here. He's done many Poets Theaters for me at Club Passim and at the Armory, and now on Zoom. Sebastian's a master storyteller. He does something that no one else does, and that is not recite from memory, but recite from heart, which means it can go anywhere. Wherever the heart leads, where the legend leads, we'll all be certainly warmed around the fire of his heart. So please welcome Sebastian Lockwood.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you. Passaconaway, you know, he came this way, and the name is Child of the Bear. But I want to go back to while I was reading many of the Native American myths, I was at the same time studying classics, and I was reading Homer's Odyssey. And I would go on to, as a storyteller, tell Homer's Odyssey. And what I discovered, which is still with me now, and it's so hard to describe, but in all of the epics I study and perform, Gilgamesh, Homer, Beowulf, Monkey: A Journey to the West, the great Chinese epic, when you are in these epics, the voice is so profound, so clear, so tight, and that seems to be almost a meta language, an ability to think in images that seems above our normal ability to write and think. This is a higher consciousness, if you like, of language. And what I found was that the Haida was the same as the Homer. And I thought, oh my God, this culture is extraordinary and very, very difficult to understand, as Homer is very difficult to understand, as the Epic of Gilgamesh is very difficult to understand. And it is a culture out of which come extraordinary cultural heroes. So fast forward through much time spent studying Native American literature, trying to understand by studying anthropology what it all meant and how it works. And one of the basic ideas in anthropology, of course, comes from Levi-Strauss, with the idea of the raw and the cooked. It's dyad, right? Hot and cold, up and down, sky and earth. The raw and the cooked, the wild and the tame, the cowboy and the Indian. Or is it the cowboy and the farmer? Cowboy and the farmer must be friends.
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, right? And what is that opposition between the cowboy and the farmer? Well, the farmer is the sodbuster who stays home. The cowboy is wild and rides the plains. He's free. And the sodbuster never trusts that freedom, always feels that there's a danger in that you need four walls and a roof, and you need laws and you need all of those structures. You can't just be out there on the plains riding. And of course, when we come back to the tribal peoples, we see this extraordinary movement where these are not sodbusters, these are not agrarians, these are people who move with extraordinary speed across the landscape, carrying that culture with them, assembling in great towns, villages that become enormous towns, that then have these great storytelling feasts, then break up as the tribes move back, flowing like the birds up and down. Now, in these eastern parts here, that movement was facilitated by all of the extraordinary rivers and lakes we have. Now, as you move to the west and the plains, you have, of course, that open landscape. Here you have the rivers. And because of those rivers, a group of 6 or 7 could move from Cape Cod to Quebec in a matter of days. I mean, it was extraordinary, the distances they could travel and the freedom they had living off these rivers. And we'll come back because of our hero to the Merrimack. And if you know the Merrimack, especially if you can think about the Merrimack and Manchester now, when you cross the big bridge going into Manchester and you go over the Merrimack and you're going to take a right to go to the airport, or you're going to keep going, from that bridge, if you look to the left, you'll see where Passaconaway lived. And Passaconaway came this way. He loved the rivers. So he lived up and down the Merrimack, all the way down to Haverhill, and then all the way back up to Manchester and beyond. And of course, in order to come to Monadnock, where he would gather the clans and tribes, and they would come to listen to his great oratory, he would come up the Kentucket. And I have no doubt that he traveled on the Kentucket and he traveled on the Piscataqua. And if he traveled on the Piscataqua, well, maybe he took a little trip up that beautiful, gorgeous little brook we call the Rand Brook. And that would have put Passaconaway right in my backyard. So I walk where he walked. Now, part of this journey I was on was really trying to understand great heroic figures. So I had the Epic of Gilgamesh, I had Homer's Odyssey, and I had Beowulf as these examples of these great heroic figures. And I would say also that the story of Jesus plays exactly into much of this heroic scape of who these heroic figures are and what they can do. So for each of these figures, they're twice born. Gilgamesh and Odysseus both go to the underworld, have experiences in the underworld, and then get born again into the upper world so they can advise people on what goes on in the underworld and how to avoid it. And of course, the same will happen for Jesus. After the crucifixion, he will go down to hell for 3 days, and he will do quite a lot down there to reorganize things and talk to various people before being born again to sit at the right hand of God. So we have that same twice born figure that comes into these extraordinary heroic figures. And each of these figures, of course, are giants as men. They're physically bigger and more powerful than the average man. And they can see further and they can hear better. And of course, they're spiritually engaged, and it quickly becomes obvious that they're leaders. And so we have the long story of the journeys, and the story of the journey is always the story of the journey of how to come home and what home is all about. And where is the false home and where is the real home? So when we come back around to the legends of Passaconaway, I discover another heroic figure who fits into the pattern of these heroes. And here we have a figure, and we know a great deal about him because several of the English colonists, writers, come up and visit with Passaconaway, try and convert him, and he converses with them, and we'll get into this later. He has very interesting view of their attempts to make him into a Christian and how they talk about religion and how he talks about religion. And what we find with Passaconaway is a man who is larger than ordinary men in so many ways. I mean, he must have stood 6'6", 6'7", almost 7 foot. They said of him that he could swim the Merrimack River. Now remember, these rivers were much fuller than they are now. He could swim the Merrimack River underwater both ways on one breath. Well, there were other things he could do. I mean, he could take a bowl of water in summer and he could make an ice cube appear in it. He could make water boil in winter. He could take a dead leaf and put it in a bowl of water and bring out a living leaf. And of course, the snakes gathered around his arms because in part of the legend of his birth, he became intimate with the snakes, and it was the snake people who gave him information that comes from before the flood. Now, you see, what's happening as soon as I start to talk like that is I'm taking the real person of Passaconaway and I'm letting my mind run away with me with the legends of Passaconaway. And we have these absolutely beautiful stories, and I believe and trust that the Pennacock people give us permission to tell these stories, because everything we say here is to honor this great sachem, this Bashaba, which means chief of chiefs, because the people would assemble to hear this extraordinary man talk with his eloquence and his power and his magic. He also could control the weather. So if he was engaged in a fight with his enemies, he could bring a sudden summer storm down on them that would smash them with rain. But he couldn't get it to work with the English. And this is what changes. So we have this image, whether we know this is true or not, but we have an image. There was a report from one of the people on the Mayflower that as they approached the coast, there was a group of Indians on the coast, and there was one amongst them who was so much bigger than all the others, a giant of a man, and they wondered who this giant was. Now, when that boat appears, this cloud riding on top of an island of trees pushed by the wind comes in. Who are those people on the Mayflower? What are their intentions? What's their culture? What do they want? What do they expect? And who are the indigenous people who stand on the bluffs and see them coming? Now, let me go first to the Mayflower people, and then I'll come back to the indigenous people. On the Mayflower people, we have Puritans. Now, the Puritans are so extreme that, put it this way, Shakespeare has been dead for 9 years. So all of these Puritans were contemporaries of Shakespeare, or just not that much younger than Shakespeare, and they knew all of his plays. And the Puritans wanted to take Shakespeare and tie him to the stake and burn him. And they wanted to forbid anybody from ever reading any of his plays. They wanted to destroy them all. That's what the Puritans thought of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare returned it. And many of his most grotesque characters in his plays are based on Puritan figures of the day. So you have these two groups, and of course, they're going to fall out as Protestant and they're going to fall out as Catholic. And the hatred between the Protestants and the Catholics, the viciousness of this fight, the willingness to torture each other over the division of what it means to be a Christian is relentless. And there are many shades of this. And on that Mayflower, there will be mainly Puritans, but there are also some on that boat who are Catholic, but are pretending to be Protestant in order to get by. And the Protestants were very worried about this. And those divisions are right there in that boat as they look ahead. These people who believe profoundly that what has happened, the Protestants believe that they've lost England now because the Reformation is over. Cromwell has been defeated. The king is back on the throne, and the Catholic Church, Anglicanism as it is coming back into power. So the Protestants feel that they need their new Jerusalem. They need to create their Jerusalem where they can rule and live as God has insisted they should. And in order to achieve this Jerusalem, God has given them the new world. Unfortunately, there are people already there. However, we have the division here between the Catholic attitude and the Protestant attitude. Now, the Catholic attitude is different, but still cannot understand that the people they are going to meet are actually human beings who are intellectually their equals. Now, within that boat, the other thing that's complicated what's going on here is the paternalism that extends to the class system. And to understand the difference between the landed gentry, the middle class, and the working classes, if you've read much of military history, you'll see how the officers are just of a different class to the average soldier. And the average soldier to them is not fully human being as they are. It's a simplistic version of themselves and needs discipline and control. And so the officer's job is like a good but very stern father to try and help the lower classes along. But they can't see them quite as themselves, and therefore they're willing to inflict extraordinary punishments because of this sense of who's fully human, who's not. You can imagine then how that is going to extend into how these people are going to confront the Native Americans they see. They're going to see them as a class which is of savages, which is below working classes, and which is perhaps below slaves as well. So not really human. And what that does is it alleviates the moral compunction of killing humans. Because if you consider someone to be subhuman, you're not going to burn in hell for murder, because after all, you can kill animals, can't you? So all of these sets of thoughts are happening. And for the Puritans, they're also deeply involved in the idea of demons and Satan. And what has happened here is the New Jerusalem has devils in it. And it's God's will that you remove and exterminate the devils in order to perpetuate the new colonial Jerusalem. That's who's going to negotiate with Passaconaway. And Passaconaway is looking at these people. And of course, when they came ashore, despite what had happened, because these coastal peoples have suffered an extraordinary plague. The smallpox and the ravages of plague have reduced the population. I'm not good with facts and figures right now, but I mean, it is something extraordinary. I want to say 90,000 to 10,000, but those are wrong numbers because it's much more. But I mean, it's 2/3, 75% of the population has died. Empty, smoking villages, death so fast they can't bury the dead. And it's out of this that the survivors are hanging on. Nonetheless, when those people from the Mayflower meet the survivors, one of the first things that happens to them is that they're just amazed by how beautiful these human beings are, because these human beings are extraordinarily healthy. Despite the plagues and everything else, they've been eating their amazing diet, living their powerful lives, and they have no sugar, so they have teeth. The Europeans have brown stubs, they have no teeth. And here are these magnificent, healthy, beautiful people exuding this health, and with these shining great teeth. Who are these people? Are these devils? Are these demons? Who are they? And so slowly these two cultures are going to begin this dance. And the problem with the dance is that Passaconaway and all of the other indigenous peoples believe that they're on equal footing, and that righteousness will be treated with righteousness, and there will be honest dealing. And right from the beginning, the intention of most of the colonials is extermination. So they will provoke, annoy, cheat, insult, anything to provoke fights. Bring it on. This is what they want. Now, there are exceptions to this, but it's very sad that it won't work. There's Thomas Morton, is Thomas Morton, who creates Merrymount. And Thomas Morton is a very different character. What we have here is what we schoolboys in England talked about as roundheads and cavaliers. It also means circumcised or not circumcised, which is what put aside the Protestant from the Catholic. You could just tell someone to drop their pants and tell which side they're on, roundhead or cavalier. And Thomas Morton was a cavalier. And as a cavalier, he loved Shakespeare's plays. He loved to drink and sing songs. He wanted to learn about the indigenous peoples, and he immediately understood that they were superior human beings, that the organization of their life, the way they treated each other, the way they treated guests, the dignity of their ways, and their extraordinary hunting abilities, everything about them he found just amazing and wanted to live with them and learn their ways and teach him what he could of his ways. Of course, they needed guns. Guns and bullets. There's an extraordinary moment when there's a initial party of colonials coming out into the woods, and a group of Pennacook warriors encounter them, and they send over a box of arrowheads to warn them to stay back, that they're armed. And the English send back a box of bullets. And that's what it's going to be, bullets against arrows. And the English colonials, of course, are terrified that the indigenous people will get guns and be able to defend themselves. However, what Thomas Morton realizes is that he wants to do town. He said, we're good at doing town and city. Let the native people do what they're good at, hunting and living their lives, and we can trade and barter and we can live together in that way. This was the same arrangement the French wanted. But this wasn't going to work for the colonials. They wanted land, 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 the way a starving man wants steak. They wanted land. So Thomas Morton sets up Merrymount and brings in the indigenous, the native peoples, and they have a wonderful time, and they make merry, and they have a, I'm blanking on a maypole, and they set the maypole up, and the Puritans are appalled at what's going on. And Morton gives them guns so that they can hunt, because of course, once they have guns, their hunting increases exponentially with the ability to use guns and to feed themselves and to engage in trade and perhaps to defend themselves. But this is anathema to the Puritans. It's also anathema that the colony's doing so well. It's doing much better than the Puritan colonies, because they're using many of the indigenous people's ways of growing plants and of surviving and doing trade, and people are happy. They're singing songs. But eventually the Puritans will destroy the town and will take Thomas Morton himself and leave him on Deer Island to either starve to death or catch a boat back to England if he can. And his life goes on, and it ends badly and at the hands of the Puritans after he comes back twice. But anyway, that's the sad story of Thomas Morton and Merrymount, which is burned to the ground. So Thomas Morton does come out and visits with Passaconaway and writes about Passaconaway and tells us that Passaconaway can do these extraordinary things. But even Thomas Morton, who really is enlightened as far as it comes from these colonials, still has to say that the powers that Passaconaway has must be satanic. It must be a witchcraft of some form. Now, again, this was the great problem with this breakdown of class system. Within the English class system, the upper class cannot acknowledge that lower class people are capable of intellectual ability as they are, because if that were the case, then they lose the paternalistic argument. You can't be paternal to someone who's your equal. So whenever a working class person had an invention or something extraordinary, they'd stamp it out quick as possible and then have one of the gentry come up with it, in order to maintain this class system where you had to keep a certain people as being subhuman. The very same way that people tried to explain a paternalistic approach to slavery, that slaves were basically so stupid and incapable that they needed masters and discipline in order to have them work, and work would set them free, and work would bring them to God, of course. So there are these contradictions where you cannot allow for a human being in this particular strata to burst through. And what are you going to do with a Passaconaway who has these extraordinary abilities? Of course, another of his abilities is he learns English and he can talk beautifully, which we will get to. So this is what is going to set up that ancient fight for us between these peoples. And what I want to do now is read you Passaconaway's description of the religion. And I want you to listen to this language now. And the way in which Passaconaway phrases these things, and this is how we have it, and God knows how it was translated, of course, So we can only imagine from the roughness of this, but still there's a beauty that shines through this language. And this is his response to John Eliot. And I'll read the lead up from Eliot. And he calls Passaconaway Passaconaway, whom I mentioned unto you the last year, who gave up himself and his sum to pray unto God. This man did this year show very great affection to me and to the word of God. He did exceedingly earnestly, importunately invite me to come and live there and teach them. He used many arguments, many whereof I have forgotten, but this one, that my coming thither but once in a year did them but little good, because they soon forgotten what I taught, of being so seldom and so long betwixt the times. Further, he said that he had many of them, and many naught, and would not believe him that praying to God was so good. But if I would come and teach them, he hoped they would believe me. He further added that I did as if one should come and throw a fine thing amongst them. Let me phrase that again a bit better. So this is the beginning of Passaconaway's speech about the religion. That I did as if one should come and throw a fine thing among them, and they earnestly catch at it and like it well, because it looks finely, but they cannot look into it to see what is within it. And what is within, they cannot tell whether it is something or nothing. It may be a stock or a stone is within it, or it may be a precious thing. But if it be opened and they see what is within it and see it precious, then they should believe it. So said he, you tell us praying to God, for so they call all religion, and we like it well at first, and we know not what is within. It may be excellent, or it may be nothing. We cannot tell. But if you come unto us and open it unto us and show us what it is within, then we should believe that it is so excellent as you say. Those are the words of a philosopher to me. And I've read that speech many times, and I can only imagine how beautiful it must be in the language. But to express religion in this way, to say, you come to us with your religion, and it's as though you roll this glittering ball in amongst us, and you tell us how beautiful it is, and that we must love it, but you can't tell us what's within. And of course, the enormous contradictions of the religion, of the story of the Jesus figure, and of course, the oppositions of love and hatred, and then what it is between these two peoples, that though they worship the same God, call themselves Christians, when they look at what the Puritans do to Thomas Morton, they just can't believe it. They liked him. he liked them. And then here come these people and they want him to tie him to a stake and burn him for his ideas, for being religious. And how are they going to explain transubstantiation? And nomine patri et filio et spiritus sanctu, in the moment of the host being raised and becoming the body and blood of God, or the symbol. Explain that to me Latin scholar, out of your Sanskrit. You know, how are you going to explain that in the indigenous way? And so there's left with this confusion. And of course, you have the praying Indians. And the colonists make much of the praying Indians and say, you know, we can take away their guns and they'll be the praying Indians. But of course, as so many have done in so many other parts of history, you pray to the God of the conqueror so you won't be killed. That's why you pray to that God. And this is, of course, going on between the Puritans and the Catholics. When the Catholics are in power, the Puritans are pretending to be Catholic to save their skins, quite literally, and vice versa. And so the praying Indians are there, and the belief that perhaps Passaconaway will be a praying Indians. But, you know, when King Philips War comes around, now, I knew very little about Passaconaway, and it was a revelation to me. And I knew even less about King Philips War. And I had read a great deal of this Puritan history in the 80s in Boston. And I didn't understand why King Philips War didn't make more of a presence. And even today in the literature, you know, many of the books seldom is referenced. And then, of course, it is a war of absolute horrors. One of the early and most insulting incidents. And this can give you an understanding of this perception, this, you know, notion of what a savage is or not. You have one of Passaconaway's, now it's a relation, I don't think it's his wife, but I do think it's a relation. It's a woman, and she's paddling down the river, and she has a young baby in her canoe. And English sailors are coming in the opposite direction. And as the sailors come close to the canoe, they tip the canoe over into the current. And the reason they do it is because they have a bet between themselves on whether or not a savage baby knows how to swim from birth. So if the baby sinks, it'll prove that they don't know how to swim from birth. That's why they tip the canoe over and drown the baby. I mean, it's just incomprehensible unless you see it in this position that defies comprehension. However, in their system of thinking, in their critical system, it makes sense because they're dealing with savages, and it's a literal question. Perhaps these savages can swim. And of course, the English sailors were notorious for not being able to swim. And they thought the savages could because they could just do it from birth, because that's how savages are. This is one of the incidents that will kick off King Philips War. Now, King Philips War will rage across this coast, and I'm sure many of you know just awful, the Great Swamp Battle, everything that goes on. Haverhill again becomes a huge center for all of this. And it's just terrible fighting, tortures and horrors on both sides, and a relentless war of extermination that will follow. Just in case you think I'm being a little extreme with that, before I get back to King Philips War, let me read the statements from some American presidents and how they think about the Native Americans. This is George Washington. Indians and wolves are both beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. That's George Washington. He'll go more in that vein. Jefferson, if we ever lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will not lay it down till that tribe is exterminated. Andrew Jackson, they have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor desire of improvement essential for favorable exchange, established in the midst of a superior race. And without appreciating the cause of their inferiority, they must yield to circumstance or ere long disappear. Theodore Roosevelt, I don't go so far as to say the only good Indian is a dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of 10 are And I shouldn't like to look too closely into the case of number 10. There you have those attitudes. That's the attitude that is fixing this war. And it is so hard for these warriors who have a code of honor similar to the knights of old, about bravery on the battlefield, about equality, about treating prisoners equally, all of these things. And it's smashed over and over and over, and they cannot understand why they're lied to, why they're tricked. At one point in the war, at Chakuk, I think is modern day Tingsborough, there's a moment where they invite a group of warriors to feast with them, saying they're parleying for peace. And in the middle of the feast, they say, we're going to do a mock battle. And of course, you know what happens. They arrange a mock battle, and their warriors have been drinking. And alcohol is another huge issue here. And of course, once they have them all lined up, the warriors shoot off blanks, and the colonialists shoot off live ammunition and massacre them all. And the praying Indians, I forgot that too. Once the King Philips War starts, there's a large village of praying Indians, I think some 700 souls or so. And they're worried that the praying Indians will take up arms against them. So they just take the whole bunch of them and they put them on Deer Island to starve to death. At the same time this is going on, part of the hunger of the war is for slaves. Native Americans make very good slaves. They're much in demand in Haiti and in Jamaica for the sugar trade. And the great problem the sugar trade has is they can't get enough manpower, and they're running out of African slaves. They can't get enough, and the African slaves die too quickly, whereas the Native American slaves have great endurance, so are much desired in many ways. And so much of what's going on is kidnapping Native Americans in order to sell them into slavery. And they'll be kidnapped and then rushed up to the north, where the Jesuits and the Catholics will turn a blind eye as they're sold off into slavery. That's another part of the horror of this whole war that's going on. So in the midst of all of this, Passaconaway has seen this coming. Now, let me go back to a happier place. There's a fun story about his birth, and I don't know if it's a legend of the Pennacook people or not that it has, but it gets told, and it's a wonderful story of how Passaconaway was born when his mother was coming up the Passaconaway River, and an old oak tree fell, and she died, and in the whirlwind, the baby was lifted high up over top of Monadnock by an eagle who dropped the baby, and the baby fell down into the eagle's nest that had been broken into 3 parts. And the baby rolled around in all the eagle feathers and shit, so that when the eagle put its nest back together and put the full floppers back in, didn't notice there's slightly big, pinkish new little bird, and grew up with the eagles until tumbled out of that and tumbled down the mountain and fell right into the bear cave. And Mother Bear picked up this little baby and thought, oh, look at all these wounds and scratches. Poor baby. I think I'll have the snake people look after the baby. So she took the baby down and put it in that rock place in Monadnock, where about 10,000 snakes will gather together. And the snakes took that baby in and rolled it and licked all its wounds and told that baby knowledge from before the flood. And then the baby came back to the bears and lived with the bears for a long time, which is why Passaconaway is child of the bear. They say, lived with the mountain lions, lived in the wild on the mountains before coming back down to his people. And it's there on the mountains that he finds his spiritual power and his great knowledge. And part of his knowledge was knowing what was going to happen with these white people. And he knew that this war was impossible, that there was no possibility that his people could fight these people. When he came to them, he said, look, they are as many as the leaves in the forest. And they keep coming and they keep coming. We cannot fight them. The only way to survive is peace, peace, peace. And he takes as many of his people as he can from his precious lands, his beautiful island on the Merrimack. Oh, do you know they'd say you could walk from one shore of that river to the other on the sturgeon in the spring? The Merrimack, what a river. So he gathers his people up and says, we're going north. There is going to be a terrible war. And our only way to survive is peace. And he takes his people up to Agamenticus, up to what is now Mount Washington. And they live high in the mountains for years until the war has run its course. And eventually he will come back and he will be allowed to live on a very small piece of the river and be left more or less in peace. And when it comes to the end of his life, he calls all the people together and he gives them his last statement. And we have this last statement. I have no idea how good the translation is, but once again, I think when you listen to the language, just the beauty of the imagery, the beauty of the language tells us of the beauty of this extraordinary man, Passaconaway. The oak will break in the whirlwind. Even now it shivers and shakes. Soon its trunk will lie broken. The ant and the worm play on it. So hear what I say, my children. I am talking with the Great Spirit. He whispers to me as I speak. Tell your people, peace, peace is the only hope for your race. The white warriors own fire and thunder. There are more of them than leaves in the forest. They will turn these meadows with the plow. They will fell the forest with the axe. They will live on your hunting grounds and make their forts where you fish. The Great Spirit tells me this, so it must be true. We are few and powerless before them. We must bend before the storm. The wind blows hard. The old oak trembles. Its branches broken, sap frozen. It bends and falls. Peace, peace with the white men. And this, so says the Great Spirit, this is the last wish of Passaconaway. Peace, peace, peace is the only hope. Now, there's a beautiful legend that follows that. And I think, you can hear in that the richness and beauty of this language, the dignity of the language, the power of the imagery, the old oak shivers and breaks, the sap frozen, this powerful imagery. And there's a very beautiful legend I've heard told several times, I believe comes from the Pennacook people, that at his death, 12 wolves were called to him. Passaconaway gave a great call and 12 wolves came to him, and he'd built an enormous sled out of hickory, and he had beautiful furs, and he lies down on the great hickory sled, and he's covered with the beautiful furs, and the 12 wolves race on up over Monadnock and tear on up the landscape until they come to the great Agamenticus, and they go flying up the sides of the mountain until that hickory canoe goes sailing up into the sky, riding up over the great Bear Star, and there Passaconaway resides with the Great Spirit and looks down on us and still says, peace. Peace is the only hope, the only way that we can heal these long divisions. And of course, I think in the face of that extraordinary desire for extermination, which is very hard to come to terms with, I know. But in the face of all of that, what is extraordinary to me is in the last 20 years, I have seen such a richness of Native American culture, such a return of the powwows, such a return of great Native American storytellers all around us. And that is what is so exciting. is that despite all of that saying it will disappear, it does not disappear. It's here and doing very well indeed, growing back. And that's the power of the story that held these people together, that gave people who had seen everything taken away from them, their ancestors and a way of life destroyed, but still the stories came down to them, and the stories of human beings of the likes of Passaconaway. One of the other episodes I haven't talked about with trying to understand what happened in King Philips Wars, I really recommend going back and rereading the Hannah Duston story. And now, if you want to come back over and put yourself in the place of the colonials and feel what their life was like, and we have extraordinary descriptions of what happens with Hannah Duston. And as you know, she's kidnapped, and this is a time at which these raids are going on. And again, this is immensely complicated because, yes, you would say these are savages coming in, burning and pillaging and taking hostages and running them all the way to Quebec and then selling them as slaves. But they're also paid mercenaries. The French are paying them to do this. They're soldiers being paid to go on raids, which any army will do, and engaging in this trade. But that's where the Duston homestead finds itself. And in the first of these raids, Hannah Duston is taken, and it's a terrifying situation. She sees two of her children killed right in front of her, and she's taken by this group of maybe 7 warriors, and they move at an extraordinary pace. And of course, their captives have to keep up or die. And Hannah, I believe, I forget if it's this journey or the next time she's captured, has just given birth. And of course, her infant is killed in a horrible way. And she will then travel with the Indians and somehow has the strength, with very little proper clothing, ragged shoes and sometimes no shoes, and walking through snow, nice. And at a certain point, they give her snowshoes to walk in, and she has to figure out how to walk in snowshoes and all of this. And nonetheless, there will come a moment where she is able to escape from her captors. And it has to do with a night when they stop on an island, and the warriors think that they have their captors safely bound and tied. And they've been met by another group of warriors who have a bottle of rum. Alcohol has been much misunderstood amongst indigenous peoples, its use and its meaning. And of course, alcohol was just had an awful effect. What is so powerfully pulling to the Indian is that in the moment of pure intoxication, they believe they can talk to the Great Spirit, that alcohol is a way to be able to communicate with the Great Spirit. Now, for the Native American, anything that is on earth was put there by the Great Spirit. And if it was put there by the Great Spirit, it must be good. So if alcohol exists, it was put there by the Great Spirit. And what it's good for is being able to leave this body and this consciousness and enter into another place where you can fully engage in the spirit world. And that is why, for the Europeans, listening to the indigenous people dancing around the fire and singing and shouting and screaming in these extraordinary ways, they're having conversations in the spirit world. The Europeans just think they're blind drunk. So once again, there's this, but nonetheless, that of course, alcohol would be a ravage, as would all of the other plagues. So Hannah Duston realizes once her warriors have finished their drinking and dancing, that they fall into a heavy sleep. And she and another woman and another companion, but completely under her leadership,
arm themselves with tomahawks and kill the warriors and the women and the two children. They kill everybody, which they had to do to escape. And they make their way back out to the canoes, and the three of them get into a canoe. And of course, these canoes are extraordinarily delicate pieces of equipment and have to be used in very particular ways. I mean, the canoe is made out of one solid strip of birch bark, hickory workings, and beautiful, but not easy to paddle. If all you've ever done before is row, how do you work this paddle? And you're setting out at night into the full flow of the Merrimack. So they have a great deal of trouble just getting to understand how the canoe works, how to shape it, but eventually they do manage to get the canoe to work, and they will paddle back down the river from somewhere well above Manchester, further up the river, and they'll be heading all the way back down to Haverhill. And on the way, evading any hunting parties because they could easily be captured again. And Hannah does something very strange. Well, I don't know if it's strange. It's extraordinary, but everything about this woman is extraordinary. She takes her tomahawk before they get in the canoes to leave. Once she has the canoes ready and the two of them, she says, wait a minute, I have to go back and do something. And she takes her tomahawk and she goes back to where the dead warriors are, and she takes their scalps. And that's not easy to do. You have to cut a line and a line and a line and a line and get the whole flap of skin to come away with the hair. But she's determined to prove what she did, and she wants to show the English authorities. So it's that important to her that you'd think you just want to get in that canoe and get the hell away from that awful place. But instead, she goes back and scalps them and puts the scalps in a bag and puts the bag in the canoe. And then they set off back down the river. And it's an extraordinary feat. I mean, where this woman had her power and her strength, I think altogether she had 11 children. She'd had several miscarriages. She'd seen at least 3, if not 4 of her children killed in awful circumstances. And she's been force marched halfway up the East Coast. And having killed her warrior captors, she is now in a canoe headed back down the mighty Merrimack River, learning as she goes that you don't use extravagant gestures. They're very small, tight gestures in the canoe. Get the feeling of this strange bark that seems alive in the river. And so she travels back down the river, seeing fires here and there, not knowing what she's going to encounter. And amazingly, she makes it back, and her husband is still there at their homestead. And she will come back, and you can imagine the reunion and their amazement. And of course, she has to give her husband the sack of scalps, which he will take to the authorities, and they will be paid for them, because both ways, scalps you could get money for, 20 pounds for scalps. That seems much too much, but they were worth a lot of money as well. And so that's how Hannah Duston comes home. And then at that point, they, of course, will start to rebuild the homestead. And when you come back up around here, you'll see many of the old houses around here that are built as defensive homesteads with the second floor further out over the floor below in order to stop people being able to climb up and in. And they would defend themselves from inside the homestead. The man would be standing at the window shooting, and the wife would be right behind him loading the gun, because those guns were very difficult and awkward to load and prime and put shot in. So while he's shooting, she's loading, priming, and doing the shot. And he gets his shot away. She hands him the gun. He's aiming again, and she's immediately loading. What they have to have inside the house, of course, is water and provisions. And I actually lived for a while in a house in Catskill called the Blue Fort. And in the basement of that house, there was a small stream that ran right across through the basement of the house on solid rock. And that's why it was the Blue Fort. And it was built in that same defensive way, because for at least the first, 200 years, the people who were trying to work this land, and of course now those of us who live on this land look in awe at the work they did, the endless stone walls we see, the clearing, and they were living in this defensive posture, and until that had been more or less eradicated and the country had moved on and the West had opened up, and you were going to have this bottleneck of Europeans on the East Coast, a huge population, massive overpopulation, until there was enough salt. So you could find a source for salt, so you could salt the food, so you could go west. And then when that western route opens up, this enormous body of human beings rushes west in that great rush. And at that point, it'll be down to the Iroquois and it'll be down to the Mohawk. And the Mohawk play a very strange role in this whole game, as do the Iroquois. But again, all of these tribes are being caught in this conflict between what the French want, what the English want, what the breakaway from the English want, what the West is going to be. There are points at which Florida and much of the West would have been an entirely different country. All of those ripples are happening, but as the East Coast empties, so you begin to have some hope for the Pennacook and the Wampanoag and the Narragansett and these peoples to be able to slowly regroup, and then to really have to live under the radar in order to survive until we could, reach our current moment in which we're able to really celebrate that world and that life again and look back at what was there. Very little is known of Passaconaway. Like I say, I look at a series of heroes. I look at Gilgamesh, I look at Odysseus, I look at Beowulf, I look at Passaconaway. And all of these men, in the same way, confronted evil and in their own way had to come to terms with evil and find good on the other side of evil. But they had to travel through that hell. And that is part of the heroic ability and why we love to have heroes, because they do what we cannot do. As Jesus would say, I went to hell, so you don't have to. Mm-hmm. And they can tell us about that. And Passaconaway was one of these who appeared, apart from being this extraordinary magician. And again, I wish we had more of his language. The eloquence we hear and the few fragments we have make us long to hear how he really talked and what it sounded like, and how the tribes would come to live together on Monadnock and listen to this great orator, this huge man who could do magic, speaking in the way he spoke. This was that great moment. Richard, do you want to add anything at this point?
No, I'm just sort of mesmerized by this whole tale and of the contradiction and conflict of the cultures. And I remember in that time when we were doing our show, talking to some native elders and saying at the time that 500 years was but a season for them.
Yeah.
And they felt that they're just waiting their time to have the land restored to them by the Great Spirit.
Yeah. I would recommend this. This is a couple of fairly good books here. This is Massacre on the Merrimack. And another one, Lisa Brooks, Our Beloved Kin, quite good on this stuff. And Until I Have No Country. Again, there's not a great deal in the literature that really references Passaconaway, and it's quite shocking. You go back to the historians in the 80s and 90s who were writing about this, and Passaconaway isn't in the index. It's very frustrating that he wasn't there. So part of what I'm trying to do is bring back Passaconaway. And I think also it's as much as possible that unless you really read as close to the original as you can, the myths and stories that's where you encounter the extraordinary intellectual experience of this culture, and the use of imagery that, you know, sometimes is so simplified, you know, all of the relationship with the animals, but it becomes this beautiful hieroglyphic way of communicating that they have about talking about the spirit world and then our world and the relationship between the two worlds.
But it seems to me that the peoples who are here spoke in metaphor. And the people coming over here did not understand metaphor, though they had the literature too to understand it. And they were more literal minded. And that's the sad part to me, that metaphor is the language of the spirit and the language of existence, I would say, or a higher existence. And if you can live that way, or if that's part of the way you live and move on the earth, then you understand these things of dwelling. And when the Europeans did not understand that at all, they were hindered by their Bible or their stories. They were limited by their own myths. And that seems to me, or misinterpreted their own myths about subduing the earth rather than dwelling upon it. And they came with other intentions, as you said, you know, many of them did. So hopefully we could get back to what storytelling is for me is metaphor, or telling the tale, not necessarily the literal truth, but the overriding greater truth of existence.
Yes. Yeah, a meta truth. Yeah. Well, thank you, Richard, for setting this up.
I think we should just applaud. Can we just applaud?
Hey, thank you.
It's amazing.